3 years ago, a man from across the street tried to fine me $200 for parking my truck in my own driveway. That's not a joke. That's the actual piece of paper he slid under my windshield wiper. And the strange part is, by the time the whole mess was over, that same driveway ended up becoming the busiest parking lot in the entire neighborhood, and the people paying me every weekend were his own neighbors. Now, to understand how things spiraled into something that ridiculous, you've got to picture the place I was living at the time. My name's Daniel Mercer, and back then I owned a little ranch house sitting on just under 3 acres outside a fast-growing suburb about 40 minutes north of Dallas. Nothing fancy, just a quiet stretch of land right where the city started fading into fields. My house had been there since the late 70s, long before the developers showed up carving the countryside into neat little grids of cul-de-sacs and identical rooftops. When I bought the place, that was exactly why I liked it. Space, peace, and nobody telling me what color my mailbox had to be. The driveway was just crushed gravel, wide enough to pull 6 cars side by side if you really needed to. It curved off the road, ran past a couple oak trees, and ended near my garage. In the summer, the dust kicked up when you drove over it, and in the winter, the gravel crunched under your tires like stepping on popcorn. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked perfectly fine. For years, the only neighbors I had were a retired couple down the road and a small horse pasture across the street. Then everything changed. One spring morning, the survey trucks showed up. Within 6 months, the pasture was gone. Bulldozers flattened the land. Concrete trucks rolled in day and night. And by the following year, a brand new development had appeared where the horses used to graze. 200 homes, all brick fronts, all nearly identical, laid out around tidy sidewalks and decorative street lamps. The entrance had a big stone sign that read Maple Brook Estates. And along with Maple Brook Estates came something else: the HOA. Now, if you've ever dealt with a homeowners association, you probably know the type of energy I'm talking about. Lots of rules, lots of letters, and people who suddenly act like they've been elected governor of the neighborhood. At first, it didn't concern me much, because technically my property wasn't part of their subdivision. My land had been there long before Maple Brook existed, and the road between us marked the boundary. But apparently that detail didn't stop them from having opinions. The first letter showed up about 3 months after the houses finished selling. I found it tucked inside my mailbox one afternoon, printed on thick white paper with a fancy green logo across the top. It said something along the lines of, end quote, "Dear resident, several members of the Maple Brook community have expressed concern regarding the appearance of your gravel driveway, which may negatively impact neighborhood property values," end quote. I remember reading it twice, leaning against my kitchen counter, trying to figure out if someone was joking. Because the message went on to suggest that I consider paving the driveway, end quote, to maintain aesthetic harmony with the surrounding homes, end quote. I actually laughed out loud. Not out of anger, just disbelief. They weren't even my HOA. So I tossed the letter in the trash and forgot about it. For a little while. Then another letter came. And another. By the third one, the tone had shifted. Now they weren't, end quote, suggesting, end quote, anything anymore. They were, end quote, requesting compliance, end quote, which still made absolutely no sense, because they had zero legal authority over my property. Eventually, I decided I should probably go talk to whoever was running the circus over there, just to clear things up. That's how I met Evan Collins. Evan lived in one of the larger houses near the entrance of the subdivision, a tall 2-story place with spotless landscaping and one of those American flags hanging perfectly straight from a pole above the garage. When he answered the door, he was wearing a pressed polo shirt tucked into khaki shorts, holding a clipboard like he'd been expecting me. End quote. "Can I help you?" End quote. He asked. End quote. "Yeah," end quote, I said, holding up one of the letters. End quote. "Name's Daniel. I live across the road. I think your association keeps mailing me by mistake," end quote. He took the paper, glanced at it, and then smiled the kind of polite smile that somehow feels a little rehearsed. End quote. "Oh yes," end quote, he said. End quote. "We've received several complaints regarding your property," end quote. End quote. "My property isn't in Maple Brook," end quote, I replied. End quote. "I'm aware," end quote, he said, nodding slowly. End quote. "However, your driveway is directly visible from our community entrance. Several residents feel it detracts from the overall aesthetic," end quote. I remember staring at him for a second, trying to decide if he was being serious. End quote. "You're talking about gravel," end quote, I said. End quote. Correct, end quote. End quote. In the countryside, end quote. He folded his arms then, still smiling slightly. End quote. We simply believe paving it would be the neighborly thing to do, end quote. That was the moment I realized something important about Evan Collins. He wasn't asking. He was used to people doing what he said. And something about that rubbed me the wrong way. I told him, as politely as I could manage, that my driveway had been there for 20 years and it was staying exactly the way it was. He didn't argue. He just nodded again and said, end quote, well, we'll see what happens, end quote. At the time, I figured that was the end of it. Turns out, it was only the beginning. Because about 2 weeks later, on a quiet Saturday morning, I walked outside with a cup of coffee in my hand and stopped dead in the middle of my yard. There was a bright orange sticker slapped across my truck's windshield. Under the wiper sat a printed ticket, $200. The reason listed at the bottom read, unauthorized parking on non-compliant surface. I stood there staring at it, the coffee slowly going cold in my hand. Then I looked across the street toward Maplebrook Estates, and something in my gut told me exactly who had left it there. That was the moment I decided I wasn't just going to ignore this anymore. I was going to walk across that road and have a very direct conversation with Mr. Evan Collins. And what he said next, well, that's when things really started to get interesting. So I set my coffee on the porch railing, grabbed the ticket off my windshield, and walked straight across the road. It was one of those warm Texas mornings where the sun already feels heavy even though it's barely 9 o'clock. Kids were riding bikes inside the subdivision. Sprinklers were ticking across freshly cut lawns, and everything looked picture perfect, the kind of neighborhood where nothing messy was supposed to exist. Except apparently me. Evan Collins was standing in his driveway when I got there, talking with another guy who looked like he'd just finished a jog. They both turned when they saw me coming. I didn't bother with small talk. I held up the ticket. End quote. You want to explain this? End quote. Evan glanced at it like he hadn't seen it before, which was impressive, considering his signature sat right at the bottom. End quote. Oh, end quote, he said calmly. End quote. Yes. That was issued this morning. End quote. End quote. I'm parked in my own driveway. End quote. End quote. Your driveway does not meet Maplebrook community standards. End quote. I blinked. End quote. For the last time. End quote. I said, trying to keep my voice level. End quote. My house isn't in your community. End quote. The jogger quietly excused himself and walked off, clearly deciding he didn't want to be part of whatever was about to happen. Evan stayed where he was. End quote. While your property may technically fall outside the subdivision boundary, end quote, he said, end quote, it still impacts the visual appeal of the neighborhood. End quote. End quote. Visual appeal. End quote. I repeated. End quote. Correct. End quote. End quote. So you're fining me $200 for gravel? End quote. End quote. It's not an official fine, end quote, he said. End quote. It's a compliance penalty, end quote. I stared at him for a long second. End quote. Let me make sure I've got this straight, end quote, I said slowly. End quote. You walked onto my property, put a sticker on my truck, and left a ticket claiming I broke your rules, end quote. End quote. Yes, end quote. End quote. And you think I'm going to pay it, end quote. He shrugged slightly. End quote. If the driveway were paved, this wouldn't be necessary, end quote. Something about that calm tone just lit a fuse in my chest. I stepped a little closer. End quote. You don't have authority over my land, end quote. Evan's smile tightened, but it didn't disappear. End quote. We'll see about that, end quote. Then he said the thing that really stuck with me. End quote. If the issue isn't addressed, additional penalties may be issued weekly, end quote. Weekly. $200 every week. For parking at my own house. I actually laughed then, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was the kind of laugh you let out when something becomes so absurd, you almost admire the audacity. End quote. All right, end quote, I said. End quote. We'll see about that too, end quote. I turned around and walked back across the road. Behind me, I could feel his eyes following me all the way to my driveway. Now here's the thing. I'm not the kind of person who enjoys conflict. I'm pretty easygoing most of the time. I mind my own business, take care of my property, help neighbors when they need it. But there's a certain line you don't cross with people. Walking onto someone's land and pretending you run it, that's one of those lines. So that afternoon, I pulled the folder out of my filing cabinet that held all the paperwork from when I bought the house. Survey maps, property deed, county records. I spread everything across my kitchen table and started reading. It took maybe 20 minutes to confirm what I already knew. My property sat entirely outside the Maple Brook subdivision. Different parcel, different zoning, different jurisdiction, which meant Evan Collins and his clipboard had exactly zero legal authority over what happened on my driveway. So the next step seemed obvious. I wrote a letter. Nothing aggressive, just clear and direct. I stated that my property was not part of the Maple Brook HOA, that they had no right to issue penalties, and that any further attempts to place notices on my vehicles would be considered trespassing. Then I sent it certified mail, so they'd have to sign for it. Problem solved, right? That's what I thought. Until the following Friday morning. I walked outside, and there was another orange sticker on my windshield. Another ticket. Same amount. Same reason. Unauthorized parking surface. I looked down the road toward the subdivision entrance and just shook my head. That evening I drove to the post office and checked the tracking number on the letter I'd sent. Delivered. Signed by Evan Collins. So he'd received it. He'd just decided to ignore it. That was the moment the whole situation shifted in my mind. Up until then, I'd assumed this was some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe overzealous HOA rules. Maybe a guy who thought he was helping his community. But ignoring a certified letter and continuing to trespass? That wasn't misunderstanding. That was arrogance. And arrogance has a funny way of motivating people. That night, I sat on my porch with a cold beer, watching the steady stream of cars moving in and out of Maple Brook Estates. It was Friday, which meant the little neighborhood park they'd built down the street was packed. Parents were circling the block, looking for parking. Kids were carrying soccer balls and picnic baskets across the grass. And I noticed something interesting. There weren't many places to park. The subdivision roads were narrow, and the park had maybe 10 official spots. Cars were lined up along the curb everywhere. People driving in circles trying to find space. I leaned back in my chair and watched it for a while. Then a thought drifted into my head, the kind of thought that starts out small and slowly grows until you realize it might actually work. The next morning I drove downtown to City Hall. Now, I've learned over the years that if you're dealing with someone who loves rules, the best response isn't always breaking them. Sometimes it's using them better than they do. Inside the building, I found the office that handled permits for small events and temporary businesses. A woman named Teresa sat behind the desk. She looked up when I walked in. End quote. What can I help you with? End quote. I explained that I owned a 3-acre property near Maple Brook Estates and that I was interested in hosting small weekend events, maybe food trucks, maybe community gatherings, and I wanted to make sure everything was done properly. She pulled up the zoning map on her computer. End quote. You're in a mixed residential district, end quote, she said. End quote. That actually gives you some flexibility, end quote. Then she told me something very interesting. I could apply for a temporary event permit. 60 days. During that time, I'd be legally allowed to run small commercial activities on my property, as long as traffic flow and safety requirements were met. I tried to keep my face neutral. End quote. That sounds reasonable, end quote, I said. She handed me the application. 20 minutes later, it was filled out. By the following afternoon, it was approved. And just like that, I had official permission from the city to operate a temporary business on my land. When I drove home, I stood at the edge of my gravel driveway looking at the wide, open space stretching between the oak trees. Then I looked across the road at Maple Brook Estates, at the cars circling for parking, at the tidy houses where every mailbox matched and every lawn looked identical. A slow smile crept across my face. Because if Evan Collins wanted to treat my driveway like it was part of his community, well, maybe it was time for my driveway to start acting like part of the community. The next day, I went to the hardware store, bought a few things, some wooden posts, a roll of bright paint, a couple cheap solar lights, and a large piece of plywood. By Sunday evening, a new sign stood at the entrance to my property, hand-painted in big block letters. Mercer Field Parking. $5. All day. I planted the sign right where every car entering Maple Brook could see it. Then I dragged a folding table near the mailbox, set a small lockbox on top, and waited. I didn't have to wait long, because about 30 minutes later, the first car pulled into my driveway. And that was the moment everything really started to spiral. But what happened next? Well, let's just say Evan Collins was not prepared for it. And by the end of the second weekend, my quiet gravel driveway was attracting more traffic than the entire subdivision across the street. which is exactly when Evan came marching across the road again. Only this time, he wasn't smiling anymore. The first car that pulled into my driveway that Sunday evening was a minivan. A woman leaned out the window and asked, "Is this really $5?" I nodded. "All day," I said. She looked over her shoulder toward the park down the street where at least a dozen cars were already circling the block. Then she shrugged, handed me a $5, and pulled right in. That was the moment I realized the idea might actually work. Within 15 minutes, 3 more cars showed up. Then 2 pickup trucks. Then a couple with a cooler who said they'd been trying to park for 20 minutes and were about ready to give up and go home. I pointed them toward a clear spot under the oak trees. They handed me $5 and thanked me like I'd just done them a favor, which, technically, I had. By the time the sun went down that evening, I had 9 cars parked across my driveway and yard. 9. And suddenly that bright orange ticket sitting on my kitchen counter didn't feel so irritating anymore. Because 9 cars at $5 each was $45. For a few hours, I slept pretty well that night. But the real surprise came the following Saturday. Word spreads fast in neighborhoods, especially when people find a cheap solution to a problem. Around 10 in the morning, the first car rolled in. By 11, there were 6. By noon, the entire gravel drive was full. Cars lined up neatly between the trees, a couple parked near the fence line, and more vehicles slowing down on the road to look at the sign. I ended up pulling an old speaker onto the porch and playing some classic rock just to make the place feel a little less like an empty lot. At some point, a group of kids set up a lemonade stand near the entrance. I hadn't even asked them to do it. Their mom walked over and said, "Hope you don't mind, they just thought it looked fun." I laughed and told her they were welcome to stay as long as they wanted. By mid-afternoon, the place had this strange little festival vibe. People walking in and out. Parents chatting while their kids ran toward the playground. Someone down the road even parked a taco truck near the park entrance. And every so often, someone would come up to my folding table, drop $5 in the box, and say something like, "Man, this is way easier than driving around for half an hour." I kept thinking about Evan Collins' face if he could see it. Turns out I didn't have to imagine it. Because right around 3 o'clock that afternoon, he appeared. He came marching across the road so fast I half expected steam to be coming out of his ears. He stopped right in front of my folding table. "What is this?" he demanded. I leaned back in my chair. "It's parking. You cannot run a commercial lot here." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out the folded permit from City Hall. Held it up between 2 fingers. "Temporary event permit," I said. 60 days. He stared at the paper like it might burst into flames. "This is a residential area." "Mixed residential," I corrected. He looked around then, noticing all the cars. The lemonade stand. The music. The families walking through. His jaw tightened. "You're creating traffic." "Actually," I said, pointing down the road, "I'm reducing it." That was when one of the parents walking past chimed in. She laughed and said, "Honestly, this has made parking way easier." Evan looked like he had swallowed something sour. "You're turning this into a circus," he muttered. I shrugged. $5 well spent. For a moment, I thought he might explode right there in my yard. Instead, he leaned closer and said quietly, "This won't last." Then he turned and walked back across the street. Now here's the funny thing. The next 2 weekends were even busier. The sign stayed up. Cars kept coming. Some families started arriving early just so they could grab one of the shaded spots. The lemonade stand kids brought a bigger table. Someone else started selling hot dogs. It wasn't some huge event or anything. Just a small, steady flow of people who were grateful not to fight for parking. Meanwhile, I noticed something else. A lot of the license plates in my driveway belonged to Maple Brook residents. They lived across the street. The same neighborhood whose HOA president had tried to fine me for gravel. Apparently, they didn't mind gravel when it saved them 20 minutes of driving in circles. Of course, Evan didn't take it quietly. Over the next few weeks, he tried everything. First came the letters. Official-looking envelopes claiming I was violating neighborhood harmony. I tossed those straight into the trash. Then came the police calls. One afternoon, a patrol car rolled up and 2 officers stepped out. They walked over, glanced at the permit, and shrugged. "Looks legal to us," one of them said. Evan stood across the road watching the entire conversation with his arms crossed. Another weekend, he tried complaining to the city about traffic congestion. A city inspector showed up, measured the driveway width, checked the permit, looked around at the parked cars. Then he told me everything was within guidelines. The whole thing became almost routine. Cars come in. Cars leave. $5 in the lockbox. Week after week. Some evenings I'd sit on the porch counting the bills and thinking about how ridiculous the whole situation had started. All because one man decided gravel offended him. But eventually the 60 days started getting close to the end. And that's when something interesting happened. One afternoon I drove back to City Hall to ask Teresa a simple question. What happens when the permit runs out? She pulled up my file on the computer. Well, she said, if the activity has been operating smoothly, you can apply for a permanent home business license. I blinked. You mean keep doing it? As long as it stays within zoning limits. The application took maybe 10 minutes. When she stamped the approval paperwork, she slid it across the desk and smiled. Looks like Mercer Field parking is here to stay. I drove home feeling like the universe had just delivered the punchline to a very strange joke. The following Saturday, I replaced the temporary permit with the permanent one. Same sign, same driveway, same $5 parking. The only difference was now it wasn't ending. Evan Collins never came back to argue after that. I think he realized the fight was over, especially once he noticed something else. Almost half the cars parked in my lot belonged to his own neighborhood. People from Maplebrook, the very community he had been trying to protect. These days the whole situation has settled into something almost normal. On busy weekends the driveway fills up by noon. Families park, walk to the park, grab tacos from the truck down the road. Kids still sell lemonade sometimes. And every so often someone asks how the whole thing started. I usually just laugh and tell them the short version. An HOA tried to fine me for gravel. What really makes me smile though is this part. The money from that little parking lot now covers my entire property tax bill every year. Every single dollar. And yes, eventually I did smooth out part of the driveway. Not because Evan wanted it paved. Just because my customers deserved a nicer surface. Still gravel though. Always gravel. Now here's the question I'm curious about. Some people say what I did was petty revenge. Others say it was just using the law the way it was written. Personally, I think it's somewhere in the middle. But I want to hear what you think. If someone tried to control your property the way that HOA did, would you have fought back the same way? Or would you have just paved the driveway and avoided the whole battle? Let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about neighborhood drama, HOA power trips, and the occasional creative payback, make sure to subscribe. Because trust me, this wasn't the last time a quiet piece of gravel turned into a very loud lesson.